So, I mean, that wouldn't add up to the whole 4 billion, but I get the idea.
The point is that
the companies, what you need here in, say, Ghana is you need the big successful companies owned by Ghanaians.
No. I'll come to that. For the aid story, and there's a book you can read, it's called Dead Aid by a lady called Dambi Samoyo. The story is that what is seen as international aid is actually stimulus to British businesses who are working in Africa around an issue that will never be solved because the systemic reasons for those issues, the UK is a part of. And I'm not exonerating our governments. I'm not in any way. But I've seen attempts of people trying to get into governments to fix the system. And we have history. History is littered with times when the West has intervened. And the final, last resort is they get the person assassinated. In some instances, they'll find a local prop to do it. So they make it seem as if it was you guys who assassinated one of yours. And you will always find them. Now, the point about Ghanaian companies being owned by Ghanaians, that for me is not the issue.
Just before we do that,
yes.
If the debt is what's trapping these countries, what stops them from just defaulting on it?
They have citizens. I mean, the easiest example of what happens, go look at Zimbabwe.
What happened there?
Zimbabwe, colonized by the British, was liberated after a brutal war in the 80s. And Mugabe was one of the guys who led that. Initially, he was a good guy. But one of the things that they didn't decouple at the point of independence was land ownership in the country. So you had all these British colonial settlers who came to Zimbabwe and who lived there, built ranches, and the things they got during colonial times transferred, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at one point he said, you know what, it makes no sense that in our country, majority of the land is owned by the colonialists and we say we're independent. So we are going to get the land back. And then the West did the big squeeze, locked them out from trade. But also, if you know about the dollar standard, which came right after World War II with Bretton Woods institutions, where every country has a portion of their reserves in the US dollars. It means that the US government can basically literally hold on to your savings.
Mm-hmm.
So if you default on debt, you still need funds to run the society. And we're not all the US. What the US government does is they print more because they are at the source. We don't have access to the source. So suddenly we default and then they hold on to your funds and then your people are hungry. A guy was joking yesterday here that I'm from the country where at one point everyone was a billionaire. Because inflation went so crazy in Zimbabwe that their currency became literally worthless.
Is that because they had no access to dollar reserves and they
had access? They were squeezed from every angle. They couldn't trade, all kinds of sanctions. Their reserves were held.
How much blame can be pointed to Mugabe as well? Was he corrupt?
Yes. He tasted power. He loved power. He wasn't going to let go of power. But the story is never always complete.
Yeah.
And the story is never always complete because the story that the bulk of the world hears comes from filtered source. CNN, BBC. They're not neutral news organizations by a long stretch. And they influence the dominant narrative about any subject. The example I always give for this is if you look at what happened with the Arab world on 9/11, the image and perception of the world about an Arab changed when those two planes went into that building. Suddenly, Arabs became categorized as terrorists. Part of the response from the sheikhs in the Arab world was that they launched Al Jazeera because they realized we need our own media outlets to counter the narrative about the Arab world and to show that for every story, the CNN, the BBC side is not the only side. There's also this side. We don't have that. Mugabe didn't have anyone to tell his story. Well, he tried to tell his story. And Mugabe is not perfect. Mugabe did really nasty things. But the story about Zimbabwe got high inflation because Mugabe was a bad guy is incomplete. Because it doesn't talk about the big Swiss. The rest of the world can isolate a country. You produce stuff you can't export. You have savings you can't touch, but you need to run society.
Why are people in Africa not more hostile to us coming over? Everyone's been so friendly and nice.
A few things. One is you've made it impossible for us to unite to do what we need to do to get out. The countries we have in Africa are arbitrary. Majority of the division of Africa into countries was done in Berlin about 110 years ago, a period of 5 years. And what it did is if the logic of it made no sense. So it fragmented us. And the West have been great at using that fragment.
Sorry, 110 years ago,
Yes.
Africa was split in separate countries. What was before? I mean, I feel really uneducated here.
No, I am too.
Yeah, I had no idea.
We were a large landmass of a number of tribes,
Okay.
right? But we didn't have
Borders.
carved borders. Carved borders were institutionalized in the Berlin Conference, a series of conferences where a few European powers came together to divide different tracts to say who owns what. And here's the way when I look at the map now, here's the way I think some of the decisions were made. On the west coast of West Africa, where we are now, from this point to this point on the border, all the way up to the Sahara Desert, Britain is yours. From this point to this point on the coast, all the way up to Sahara Desert, France, it's yours. This point to this point, all the way up, Germany, it's yours. What those maps then did was that they broke entire tribes into multiple countries. So if you look at the northern region of West Africa, the north of the countries of West Africa, like Ghana, like Togo, like Benin, like Nigeria, and on the other side, like Ivory Coast and co. There's one tribe that cuts across all those countries. They're called the Hausa Fulani. So the guys in the north of Nigeria and the south of Niger, which is above us, are Hausa Fulani. They speak the same language, have the same history, have the same ancestors. But now they're in different countries. They feel more allegiance to the tribe than to the country. How do you come together and collaborate and push out an invader if you guys can't even sit together at a table to talk? And the West have also been brilliant. Every time we try to aggregate, to have a common voice, it's very easy for them to find one dissenter or two dissenters from the fragment and get them to scatter the whole cat. A few years ago, our government, strangely, next to impossible, somehow it happened. We signed a deal for a free trade agreement across Africa. Of course, now the conversation is now around how do we even operationalize it. But the fact that it even happened was a miracle. Because ordinarily, anything like that would strengthen us. Again, a lot of this is because of the debts that our government entered in the 80s and the 90s. The guys that we owe money to, World Bank, IMF, most times will send a technical advisor to your minister in government or to your president in government, who is basically making sure that the policy and the policy agenda favors their own long-term interests at the detriment of our own people.